Hello, and welcome back to Philosophy 1050, an introduction to philosophy. This is Lecture 6. Today, we're going to be covering Plato's Republic. So, specifically, we're going to be covering the chapter, because it is a big work, of Plato's Republic titled The Supremacy of the Good. Now, before we get too carried away, I think it would be helpful if I gave a bit of context about what's going on in the Republic. In this work, the aim is to lay out guidance for how to set up a perfect society. In order to achieve this perfect society, the idea is there needs to be a class of highly educated and competent people that are referred to by Plato as guardians, although it should be noted the person talking in this work is Socrates. In the previous chapters, the virtues of such guardians were discussed, and these virtues included things like morality, self-discipline, courage, and discipline, more generally. Now, Socrates states that when we're talking about the definition of these things, and so that we're to understand them, we need to be very careful, because anything that misses the truth, even by a little bit, is nowhere near enough. And that kind of comes back to Plato's sort of idea of the forms. Anything that is even a little bit less than perfect isn't quite the form. So, to that end, Socrates says that all of those virtues have something more fundamental in common, namely goodness. And that is one of the central topics of this chapter we're going to be looking at today. Now, the fundamental question of the chapter, though, given that, well, this is philosophy, is what is goodness? And that is what Socrates sort of sets out to give us an idea of in this chapter. So, two common answers are given to this question, and he lists them. The first one is knowledge. So in other words, what is goodness? Goodness is knowledge. The other option given is that goodness is pleasure. Now, remember from our lecture on the pre-Socratics, the goodness as pleasure is the stance of hedonists. Now, for knowledge, what's wrong with saying that knowledge is what goodness is? Well, that forces us to say something strange, like the knowledge of goodness is good. But that's circular, because if knowledge is what's good, and knowledge of knowledge is good, what does that even mean, right? So, it can't be knowledge, because then the knowledge of goodness wouldn't be good. And that doesn't make sense for Socrates. What about pleasure? Well, this forces us to accept that there can be things that are both good and bad. Why is this? Well, because some people like certain things, while other people hate those things. And so if what is good is just about pleasure, then something can be both good and bad at the same time, which, if it's the kind of capital G goodness that Socrates is trying to get at, that's just not going to do it. So Socrates remarks, given these bad definitions of goodness, that people are content, basically, to appear good to others. But at the same time, people aren't okay with owning something that only appears good. So they have these kind of double standard when it comes to goodness. So returning to the guardians, they must actually be good, not just appear good. This requires that they possess knowledge of what goodness is. And it brings us back to our topic. Now, Socrates is asked at this point what he thinks that the good is. Because, Socrates is going on and on about how nobody knows what the good is. Well, Socrates, tell us, what do you think the good is? And instead of giving a straight answer, he says that, first of all, he can't give an answer because he doesn't have any proper real knowledge of the good. That being said, he tries to give a few allegories so that we can kind of get close to what we think we mean by the good. So the first of these allegories is known as allegory of the sun. So in this allegory, we basically have a comparison between the sun and whatever it is that's goodness. So he's comparing these two things. Now, just because you have working eyes, Socrates says, doesn't mean that you can see. In order for you to see, you need this extra thing. You need the sun to, bounce light off of objects so that you can see them. In the same way, then, says Socrates, just because you have a mind doesn't mean that you can understand things. You also need basically to be lit up, as he says, by the light of truth and reality. And if you do that, then you'll have awareness and knowledge. So Socrates basically here is trying to say that in the same way that we couldn't see anything without the sun, we couldn't actually know anything, reliably if there wasn't some sort of good thing out there that is providing that reliability to us. So Socrates says then, sight and light and the sun resemble the mind, truth, and the good. But they're not the same thing. They just resemble each other. The good lies on kind of like a higher plane, or in other words, the world of forms, which Plato championed. That's where this sort of mystical kind of goodness exists. Now, the next allegory that Socrates gives is known as the divided line. And this one, I think, is maybe in some ways the least helpful if taken on its own, but it's alright. So, in this allegory, Socrates says that the world is divided up into 4 realms. So if we take a line here, and we choose a certain proportion, right? So let's pick about 75%. And we divide the line that way. And then we do the same thing with these 2 pieces here. So this piece here, about 75% would be about here. And this piece here, 75% would be probably, I don't know, about there. It doesn't matter, I don't have to get it perfect. The point is that we have these 4 realms. Sorry, my pen seems to be dying on me. I'm going to switch to blue. So, in the first realm, we have things that are just likenesses. Or in other words, images. And we only know about things in this realm through conjecture. Or in other words, in some ways, guessing. Perhaps educated guessing, but guessing nonetheless. The next realm is something like solid things. So this includes, normal objects. There you go. Solid thing. And generally speaking, we know these solid things relatively confidently. The next realm is the realm of thoughts. And this realm is arrived at by appealing to solid things. So basically, you're just appealing to the things in this area in order to figure out something else. So, if you're dealing with a bunch of different pens, then at that point you might be thinking of something like the form of pens. Forms, right? So this layer here is kind of like the first step into the intelligible realm, and it seeks at establishing certain universals like forms. And lastly, we have the realm of knowledge. Now, this realm isn't arrived at by appealing to anything on this side, or in other words, in the sensible world, because here, I should write this, we have the sensible world, and here we have the intelligible. So, the knowledge realm is something that is arrived at not by appealing to anything here, but rather by appealing to things here and synthesizing them. It's aimed at for the sake of establishing a discussion rather than ending one. So instead of saying that, well, according to what we know here, this is what we can say about it, here what you're doing is saying, according to what we think we can say about things, there must be this one thing that is true. So, given that we know that there's this one thing that must be true, we can start from there and work our way up. Now, this allegory may seem a little bit strange, but to explain it better, Socrates gives us a third and final allegory. And this one, arguably, is the most famous. So, the last allegory we have is the allegory of the cave. Now, in order to explain this, I think it'd be easiest if I just draw the cave. So, we're going to go to this side here. So, in the very bottom of the cave, here's the cave, we have some prisoners that are tied up. And it doesn't matter how they're tied up, the point is that they're tied up and they can only look forward. And behind them, there is kind of like a wall. And behind that wall, there are some prison guards who are carrying things like, let's say, pots on their heads and like different shapes, like sculptures of tiny horses and stuff. And behind that is, I'll even do it in red here, a fire. And that fire casts shadows off of the objects and causes them to appear on the wall in front of the prisoners. So all that the prisoners can see is right here. They have no idea not only about themselves, but about what's behind them. All they can do is see shadows and occasionally hear the sounds that the prison guards are making. Now, behind this fire pit, the cave keeps going. And it goes up, and then there's something like a cave entrance. And then you have the outside with the sun. So, Plato's cave is basically a place where the prisoners are shackled from birth so that they can only see what's directly ahead of them, which is a wall covered in shadows. On that wall, the shadows are being cast by puppeteers behind the prisoners, and the prisoners can only ever see the shadows. But they can also hear the sounds the puppeteers make. So maybe the puppeteer that is holding the horse statue would make horse noises. And whenever the prisoners hear a horse noise, they expect a horse shadow to appear. And really, because that's all they know, they really can't imagine anything else. Now, behind the puppeteers, as I mentioned, is the fire and the tunnel that leads outside. And a sunny landscape with presumably maybe even, some lakes or ponds or something like that lying around. Now, Socrates asks us to imagine what would happen if we were to set the prisoner down there free. And let's assume there's a few prisoners, let's say 3. What would happen if you let one of those prisoners free? Well, first of all, it would be painful for them to get up and look around because A, they haven't been using any of their muscles at all, and B, if they happen to be so unlucky to turn around and look at the fire, they would basically be blinded because the fire would be far brighter than anything they've ever seen in their life. In fact, Socrates continues, the prisoner probably would think that they're hallucinating. They would probably think that the only stuff that is real is still those shadows, and this weird hallucination they're having right now is a dream or something like that. And they would probably try to, put themselves back in their place and just look at the wall because they're freaking out too much. Now, Socrates asks us to imagine what would happen if not only unshackling the prisoner, but what if we took the prisoner and dragged him up the cave and outside? What would happen to him then? Well, again, there would be lots of pain and bewilderment. I mean, he'd be entirely confused, seeing all kinds of things that he could have never imagined before. Their eyes, not being adjusted to the light, would make them basically blind outside because, they haven't ever seen that much light, and it's not even anything compared to the fire inside. And so, at first, they wouldn't be able to look at much, but gradually, the prisoner would be able to look at reflections in the ponds, and then maybe at the objects themselves, and then up to the stars and the moon at night, because those aren't quite as bright. And then, finally, they would be able to look up at the sun. Now, probably not directly at the sun, but, they could have the sun roughly in their vision and they'd be okay. So, having seen that, or having seen the sun, Socrates continues, that prisoner would likely be able to immediately tell that the sun is what's responsible for all this light that they're seeing. It would be completely obvious to them because this sun is the most bright thing out there. Now, furthermore, the prisoner at this point probably would finally feel a little bit sorry for his fellow prisoners down there. Indeed, he would probably he would rather be poor up here in this real world than be the coolest guy down in the cave. Socrates gives us something kind of fun to imagine here. So, with the prisoners in the cave, they compete over who can identify the shadows the best and the most reliably. And so they play this kind of game, and whoever can do it the best is kind of like has the highest status amongst these prisoners. Now, if this free prisoner would go back, not only would he not see any value in these weird games that the prisoners are playing about stuff that isn't even real, but if he were to play along with them, he would probably do very badly because having gotten used, his eyes being adjusted to the light that is outside, if he goes back down the cave, then everything is dark again and his eyes aren't adjusted to it. So he would probably do very badly in those games that the prisoners play. And so the prisoners would see him coming back from the outside and they would just be like, oh, what happened? He's gone blind, So the prisoners would basically associate going outside of the cave with going blind. Going outside of the cave to them would be clearly a bad thing for you. Now, so too, Socrates argues, does it work with goodness in the intelligible realm. Someone who has returned to the sensible world after witnessing the idea of goodness sort of is a little bit clumsy and awkward in some ways. Aloof and impractical, some might say. If they were to argue in court, for example, about the nature of the good, then they probably would seem silly to the people in that court. And this is perhaps Plato's nod to Socrates' defense of himself in the Apology. In all, Socrates says that we shouldn't ridicule those that seem to be confused, because there's two options. Either the people who are sort of confused and stumbling about, they're either the people who are going up and out of the cave, or they are the people who are going down into the cave. If they are the people who are coming up and out of the cave, then you should be happy that they're confused because they're going through a very positive thing. In the case that they're going from the outside into the inside, then you shouldn't ridicule them. Instead, you should basically pity them because they're going from a better place to a worse place. So Socrates concludes by stating that returning to the cave is needed. Returning to the world of the sensible, in other words, is required. Education is kind of like freeing the prisoners, Socrates says. It's a matter of reorientating where they're looking so that they can, in some ways, free themselves. The best of us, Socrates continues, must climb up and out of the cave, but not get so wrapped up in the beauty of the outside that they're willing to leave behind the people who are still in the cave. The best of us should not only go up, but come back down and try to bring more people up and out of the cave. And the point of this is that the point of a community isn't to make just one group well off, just the smart people who figure out that they should get out of the cave. But rather, it's the point of a community is to raise the welfare of the whole community. So this requires the best of us to sacrifice our time in the world of the intelligible in order to stay in the world of the sensible and educate others. Leaving the world of the sensible isn't fun. But Socrates remarks that the best rulers are often the ones who least want to rule. They are the ones who see leadership as a burden rather than a reward. Indeed, rulership, says Socrates, should be a burden, because if rulership isn't a burden rather than a reward, then people basically will fight over that rulership, and that will cause internal wars. So, to put this again, and to make this very clear, what Plato is doing here is he's shifting everything over one. So we are imagining this in our world now, but actually what Plato wants to say is that the sensible world ends here, and the intelligible world is over here. And basically, the prisoners in the cave, that's you and me. We're the ones who are still stuck looking at the shadows in this world that we live in and getting all wrapped up in them. And we're not noticing that there is this other exit to the cave that we could actually see. So in this allegory then, the sun would actually be goodness, right? The fire would be the sun. You see where I'm going with here? In the allegory of the sun provides the light which allows us to see. And the sun is like goodness because it also gives us an important form of light to our mind that we need to see. So if you are to truly know goodness, you need to get up and out of this physical, sensible world, not by dying or anything, but by thinking, and climb your way out into the world of the intelligible, where you can, if you spend enough time getting used to it, you'll be able to see the form of goodness. There's no promise that you'll be able to explain it when you come back, just as there's no promise for the prisoner that he'll be able to explain what the sun is to his fellow prisoners when he comes back. So to conclude, Socrates gives us in this chapter some idea of what the good is, but he doesn't actually define it, because he himself doesn't have enough knowledge to do so. Instead, he says that whatever the good is, it exists in the realm of the intelligible. And to access that realm, we need to look past the shadows of the ordinary world. To do so is difficult, scary, and even painful sometimes. But it is worthwhile. Once we have done this, it is important not to just stay there in idle contemplation, but to take the knowledge you get from that and bring it back to the sensible world so you can help others with it. Now, with that said, this concludes this lecture on Plato's Republic, specifically the chapter Supremacy of the Good. There are far more chapters that we could get into, but this is one of the most famous and dense. I encourage you all to read more of Plato's Republic if you're interested, and you can certainly take an ancient philosophy class, a course where the focus will be placed more on picking apart Plato's Republic and all of its chapters. Well, join me next time where we will cover Aristotle and his metaphysics. See you there.